Okay, for some reason, I have a lot of books to talk about this week. So let's go ahead and start talking about it. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and this week I'm going to talk about the books that I'm reading, the books that I'm not reading, the books I'm currently in the middle. It's a little smorgasbord of everything. I'm going to start by talking about the books I'm not reading or haven't started, and it's these three here: Lovely One, Tender as the Flesh, and The Known World. And I will either talk about later in this video or when I do my reading wrap up for the month as to why I am currently not reading those books. There are two other books in my stack that I showed that I'm also not going to talk about, but I want to mention real quickly because I will be reviewing them soon, and that is Books Are Fallen. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison and The Women by Kristen Hanna. The Bluest Eye ended up being my viewer pick for the month of February, and so I will be doing a standalone review on it. And The Women by Kristen Hanna is a book that I'm reading for my book club here, and I have some thoughts to share. And I decided that I will just share that in a whole separate video that I've already filmed, actually, and I just need to edit. So there will be a standalone review coming up on that one as well. The first two I'm going to talk about are right here, and I'm going to start with A Room with a View by E M Forster. Let me start out, of course, by summarizing what this book is about. This book explores the story. This book tells the story of Lucy Honeychurch, who is a young woman on vacation in Florence, and she lives in a world that is full of tact and proper manners. And in Florence, she discovers that there is the possibility for more freedom of life and thought and attitude than she's experienced before. And she comes across this when she meets the family of the Emersons, which consists of the father and son George. And through her interactions with them, she begins to discover that there may be more to life than what she thought there was. When Lucy returns home, she finds herself faced with the choice between doing and living the life that is expected of her, or finally letting go of all guidance and roaming free. This book covers the topics of self-discovery, authenticity, beauty, and women's roles in society. There were multiple highs in this book for me, including the language used throughout the book as well as the setting. The characters, per usual, were also a great highlight, and I'll start by talking about the characters. I don't think it's so much that the characters themselves that I love in Forster's writing. I really think it's their dialogue and his use of dialogue in the book and with his characters. That's a great way of imitating speech patterns in his dialogue, just the sort of overlapping nature of natural dialogue in group settings. And it was something that I loved in Howard's End, I love in this book, and makes his audiobooks really exciting to listen to. Just the way he writes dialogue in groups of people and between people so well imitates the way people speak in life that you just really feel like you're in a room full of people discussing a variety of different topics and conversations. And yeah, I just really enjoy and appreciate that about his writing. He also has some really beautiful passages here in describing nature, describing different like events and people's perspectives on the events as they're happening. There's a certain amount of immediacy in what is going on in here, and it's not a false immediacy, but it's truly just a slowed down in the moment. We're experiencing something and we don't really know what it is until it's then happened. Just kind of like happens in real life where you don't totally understand what's going on in the moment, and then when you can reflect back on it, you get a better sense of your own experiences. The characters in here are all very beautifully developed and well fleshed out, whether you like them or not. He always includes a variety of different types of personality types, and he's really good at having complex characters who aren't quite villains, but are definitely people you just can't like. And probably the final thing that I really enjoyed about this book and Forster's writing in general is that I feel like his writing style is just very uniquely him. And it's one that I feel like I could pick out of a lineup of various authors, particularly if you gave me a segment of dialogue from his books. I did have a few lows in this book. And I think the main one for me was surrounding elements of the plot. I found the pacing of this book at times kind of just dragged in the narration and prose sections. It just didn't move along at the pace that I wanted, and I felt like we got kind of caught up in some of the dialogue that was happening, where a scene would come and it just didn't move forward in a way that felt fluid. I felt like we would just be focusing on something and it would take a while for the clarity to come as to what the purpose of a scene in the book was. And while I think there were some similarities to that in Howard's End, I didn't feel like they worked as well in this book. So in some ways, I feel like the things that I like about Forster in general, I liked less in how they were done in this book. Sadly, for me, I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars, which is not a particularly low rating for me, but given that I was really hoping this was going to be a 5-star read for me, that was a bit disappointing. I would still recommend this book to anyone who likes sort of a slow burn romance because there is a bit of that in here. And I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who likes there to be tension in their book between the authentic self versus societal expectations, because that's probably a larger theme or central idea in this book. And I would say that is especially true if you like to consider women's roles in society and the way that people, especially during the Edwardian era, were sort of forced to behave towards one another. It does also explore class issues, but I feel like that's not as big an element as some of the other things that I've discussed. So that was A Room with a View for me. I was really hoping to love it more. I do like it, and I can definitely see between this and Howard's End why some people like one more than the other, because I think depending on which one you read first will really mess with your idea of what you expect from Forster. The books are similar in some ways and very different in some of the same elements. The next book I got to off my list was Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. This is the second book in the Earthseed books. And so I'm not actually going to talk a lot about what the plot of this specific book is about because, if you haven't read the first book, telling you what this book is about will spoil things a little bit. I will mention, however, things about the series in general. One, somebody pointed out to me that this is an unfinished series, and I know that's something that can frequently bother people. However, I do have to say, with the way this book ends, if somebody hadn't have pointed that out to me, I'm not sure I would have realized that. I feel like this book itself does resolve really well and concludes in a point that I find actually very satisfying. So if that was a reason you were putting off reading this book, I would say no, read it anyway. You will feel like the series is concluded and resolved. I could also see how this series could have been continued, and I would have loved for it to be continued because you want to know what's going to happen next, but it's not a cliffhanger ending by any means whatsoever. In terms of describing this series as a whole, I'll just mention what it says off of the back, which is originally published in 1998. The shockingly prescient novel's timely message of hope and resistance in the face of fanaticism is more relevant than ever. And I think that is totally true about this book and this series in general. There are a couple of different topics that this book covers, such as survival, found family, methods of coping, and religion or theology, depending on how you want to look at it. My highs in this book largely surrounded the setting again and the language. That has definitely been a theme in the books that I've been enjoying lately. And I would say I enjoyed the same things about this book as I did in Parable of the Sower. One, Octavia's writing in this book is beautiful. It's just so well written, so clear and concise and profound and deep. And the world that she sets this in is really dark and bleak, but also poignant in some ways. It's just such the perfect setting for this book and for the topics that she explores. And so I just really appreciate her writing. I don't know that there's been many science fictions that I have read that I felt like were so well written, especially as a dystopian novel. There is definitely a higher category and level of writing in this, while at the same time, the thoughts and ideals explored are very clear and accessible. I think another thing that I liked about this book is that even though the setting is very bleak, there are a lot of dark, heavy things that are happening, there is still this level of like hope and perseverance that pervade the entire book and help you, as well as the characters, to get through it. I think the biggest lows in the books at times for me, and I think that would exist for other people particularly, is just the themes and the topics of religion and theology that come up in here. This book and the first book have a lot to do with this religious ideology and theology of who God is and fanaticism in religion and just in people's ideas of who God is and how people use that to cope or not cope. And if those aren't topics that you enjoy exploring and thinking about, then you will probably find this book really frustrating and or boring or whatever. I will also say that another low in this book is the view of Christianity, particularly in this book. More and more emphasis is placed on Christians and Christian nationalism, though that's not the term used in this book, but that's basically what's being talked about. And all of that is viewed very, very negatively. And there are some people who would be very turned off by that. So that's something you should know going in. That's one of the central topics in this book. Not Christian theology per se, but just that Christians in this book are viewed negatively. Rightfully so, because they're characterized very negatively. I still ended up giving this book 4.5 stars because I do enjoy the topic of theology and discussing religion and thinking about who is God and just how people may or may not use religion as a type of coping mechanism. And I wouldn't say this book explores just religion as a coping mechanism. There is constant referral to how people are coping in a very, very harsh world. And I think that is just a very important topic in general. I think this book is a great book for anybody who liked the first book in the series. I think it's just as good as the first book and continues things along in a very fascinating yet different manner. I think anyone who likes Octavia E. Butler and has read other works of hers would also like this series as a whole. If you like dystopian novels, I would definitely give this a try. If you like thinking about topics of God, theology, religion, or just how to cope in a world that is full of suffering and cruelty, this is a book in a book series that I would recommend. So that brought me to the end of my February TBR. And I had to figure out what to read from that point on. And to do that, I decided to end up going back and sort of updating my February TBR. Well, let me talk about the books that I picked, the fact that I already read them, and what my thoughts are on them. I'm going to start with talking about Black Boy. This was the unicorn pick that I pulled out of the jar. In fact, let me take back my bookmark before I forget I put it in here. So this was a book that I had quite a few viewers vote on for my February pick, but it did not end up getting picked. And they had recommended that I read this because they thought it would be a really good book to follow up reading after Invisible Man. And at first I couldn't imagine why, but as I continued to read, I was like, oh, I get it. Wow. But before I go into that connection, let me first tell you what Black Boy is about. So Black Boy is the autobiography of Richard Wright, and it tells the story of him growing up in Jim Crow South and his journey to manhood, self-discovery, and acceptance in a lot of ways, as well as rejection. This book talks about a variety of topics as he goes through life, including race relationships, the Black experience, hunger, family, trauma, and abuse. And as I may have mentioned, learning to live as a Black man in America. Had quite a few highs in this book. Even though it didn't necessarily start out with a whole bunch of highs. One, like I mentioned, if you've read Invisible Man, you will really appreciate this book, as I came to appreciate this book really about a third of the way in and on. I found his writing really engaging. I was just sucked into his storytelling. I think Richard Wright is a really good storyteller, especially of his own life. In some ways, there were times where I forgot this was actually his recounting of his own life because it just felt like a story. Sometimes because the things happening to him were almost unbelievable in nature. But he even talks about how he couldn't believe that some of the things that were happening to him were actually happening to him, or that some of the people he met, he was like, who are these people? He kept saying that, and I just thought that was funny. He has a really strong voice throughout his book, and I just think this is a great autobiography that really touches at the heart of a human being and draws you into his experience and his understanding of the world and himself. I actually listened to the vast majority of this book on audiobook, but I did take time to go and you can see tab the book at a couple of points in things that just really stood out to me. So it was nice to have the physical book on hand. This is definitely a book I would go back and reread at some point. I will say the biggest low for me in this book was how it started. It starts in his childhood naturally, but his childhood sadly is full of a lot of neglect and abuse, which one was really hard to read, but more than that, really made me concerned that this was going to be another book like Educated or Glass Castle, where it was just going to be the story of somebody's horrific experience of neglect and abuse as a child. And the more I read memoirs or autobiographies that are like that, the more I'm like, are we reading about someone's trauma as entertainment? And so I was concerned that this was kind of going in that same direction. I could also think of I'm Glad My Mom is Dead is another book that kind of made me feel like that. And so I was starting to get discouraged and thinking, oh no, this is now just a guy's experience of similar things. But then the story began to change. It really was an impactful part of his childhood and did help shape how he approached the rest of his life. He first had to learn whether to accept or reject his family's treatment of him, and that really did shape him into the person he was later in life and help him decide how to navigate the world of the other children around him, of the race relations in the South, and his experience in time when he eventually moves to Chicago. I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars. I would recommend it to anyone who enjoys a good autobiography, as well as to anyone who has read Invisible Man and appreciated that book and maybe wasn't as big a fan of the surrealism or at times absurdism in that story. I think it would be amazing to read these books syntopically or simultaneously together because there are a lot of overlaps in the story. And knowing that Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison were actual friends in real life, I wonder how much of Invisible Man was actually inspired by Richard Wright's life itself. But it's hard to say because Richard Wright does make it clear that some of his experiences were very common experiences for African American men during the time that he was alive. So if you like stories of self-discovery, of survival, or just want to know more about the Black experience and perspective in the Jim Crow South, then this is an excellent book to read. Next, because like I said, in theory, I picked up these books because I wanted lighter reads or at least something that wasn't as dark and challenging. I don't know that that was the best pick next, but this one was, and it's A Circle of Elephants by Eric Dinerstein. This is a children's novel, I would say middle grade for sure, just based on the writing style. And it tells the story of Nandu, who is a 13-year-old boy who is the youngest elephant driver at the Royal Elephant Breeding Center in Nepal. And his story is being told as he is on a series of adventures and events that occur as both man and nature try to invade and potentially ruin both his life, livelihood, and those of the animals that he cares for. The topics discussed in this book include the idea of found family, animal welfare, poaching, human trafficking, surprisingly, tolerance, and caring for your fellow humans and animals. It was a very heartwarming story with a lot of highs, including the plot and pacing of this book, which is what actually initially drew me to it, was the opening chapter. It is really well plotted, really well paced. You just move from one event to the next in here very smoothly, very coherently. The story is just so well told by our protagonist and elephants. Like that was a huge high. Lots of mention of elephants. The main elephant in here is just so charming in the characteristics you get of him and the relationship that he has with the young boy is just like every elephant lover's dream. I don't know that I would say there are a lot of lows in this book, but I would maybe give a content warning, especially to parents who are considering giving this to their child to read. If your child or you are very sensitive to animal cruelty, there are some, I would say, lighter descriptions of harm coming to animals in the book. Because, like I said, it does discuss poaching and that kind of thing. There's not detailed descriptions of what's happening, but there are some in the book, and so you might want to check ahead and see how much that may bother you. I gave this book 4 stars and would recommend it to anyone who wants a heartwarming story that features animals and found family, and it tells a plot-driven story of how one young boy can really make a difference in his community and help take care of all those around him. There is also some really interesting discussion of like tolerance in terms of religious and cultural tolerance in here. So it's a good book for that as well. And then the final book I have to discuss that I finished not this week, since I last updated you, was Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And this definitely falls into that category of stories about people, survival, and like just the human experience. This tells the story of Janie, who, kind of like Lucy Honeychurch, finds herself caught between the expectations of those around her and what she really needs or wants out of her own life. This story covers topics like societal expectations, gossip and the nature of gossip and the effects of gossip in communities, toxic relationships, love, romance, marriage, and women's roles, particularly during this time period, which I'm not exactly sure what time period this is happening in, but I believe it's also in Jim Crow South in Florida. The highs for me in this were definitely the writing and the language, particularly the use of similes and metaphors and motifs. There is just some beautiful, breathtaking language in here, particularly in Hurston's use of similes and metaphors to describe the interior life. I just cannot say enough about how she talks about Janie's interior life and her experience of love and rejection and the world around her. All of that just blossoms into this amazing ongoing motif having to do with seasons and particularly springtime. And I loved it every time it came up. The low in this for me is that it does surround quite a few toxic relationships, and it definitely gets into that discussion of like what is romance and what is love, though in a very fascinating way. And it definitely involves that question, but it can make you uncomfortable with the number of toxic and abusive relationships in this book. I wouldn't say the book is about abusive relationships, and there's not a lot of abuse that is gone into in any sort of deep description, but it is there, and if that's a theme you're sensitive to, you should know about that. Another thing that people might struggle with in reading this book is the dialect. Zora Neale Hurston is really well known for trying to communicate the dialect that exists in the Black community. And quite frankly, I have to say, I find the way she writes it rather difficult to interpret. There is like a name for how you write dialect, and I would argue that I'm not so sure that hers was very successful, though I appreciate the fact that she was trying to do that. That said, if you read this book and you find the dialogue really hard to understand, I highly, highly, highly recommend the audiobook, which was recommended to me before I started this book. And the audiobook says, particularly the one that I listened to, said it was performed, and it was excellent. I gave this book 5 stars, would recommend it to anyone that likes to explore the complexities of love and romantic relationships, doesn't mind looking and exploring toxic relationships, and also anyone who enjoyed Far From the Madding Crowd or A Room with a View. I think there are a lot of overlapping and similar themes and ideas and storytelling in this, and I actually think this book is very similar and reminds me a lot of Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. So if you've read that book, you will probably like this book, and if you liked this book and haven't read Far From the Madding Crowd, read that book. Though I will say, I think she plots and paces her books better. Okay, so you may have seen at the beginning of the video that I had 2 stacks of books. I think the one on my right was all these books, the ones that I had finished and didn't read, and the second stack was actually the stack of what I am currently reading, and I haven't been discussing those in my weekly wrap-up videos videos, I've just been showing them to you. So here they are real quickly for you. Like I mentioned, I have paused Free Food for Millionaires and may pick it up by the end of this month. We'll see. I'm in no hurry with that one. I'm currently still in the middle of Don Quixote. I'm reading about 26 pages of this per day. I am listening to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz on audiobook. I am just currently planning on listening to the first book. This is a, I think, 5 or 6 volume set. This is volume 1. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is book 1 of 3 in volume 1, if that makes sense. So that's my audiobook right now. And then I am currently also physically reading Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. And I am still listening to One Song of the Day out of Year of Wonder. I will put on the screen my 2 favorite songs so far this month. So if you want to go and listen to those, you can find them on my playlist, which I will link in the description box below. That's it for me. Let me know how your reading has gone in the month of February, and I will talk to you next time.